And then you will learn a simple way of implementing state in our app. So let's open up index.js, which is where we're going to put our controller. So again, each model and each view will get its own file for each of the functionality. But for controllers, I'm going to put all of them into the same file because that makes it a lot easier. As you will see, when the file gets bigger and bigger as we're adding more controllers. And it will be easier to have them all in one file, okay? So let's now talk a little bit about something called state. So imagine our final app running with all the search queries, the recipes, the likes, the shopping list. So what is the state of our app in any given moment? So think about what is like the current search query, or what's the current recipe, or how many servings are currently being calculated, and what's currently in the shopping list. So all of these things in one given moment are the state. So all this data in the current state, in the current moment of our app, all of this data is the state, and we want that to be in one central place, like one central variable, like an object in which we have then basically all the data that defines our app in a given moment in one place, in one object. Okay, so that's what we're going to implement now, and it's actually very easy, at least in our very simple app like this. Okay, now there are entire libraries for state. Maybe you've heard of Redux, which is used together with React. So that's a very popular state management library. But in this case, we will just do something very simple, just one object, which is the state of our app. In Redux, this is like the store, it's called the store, but let's just call it state here, okay? So const state, and for now it's empty. And let's actually add a comment here. So saying the global state of the app. And in here we will have the search object. So all the data about the search, which we actually already coded up in the last lecture. So remember, in the search object is where we have the search query and the search results. And so that will be part of our state. Then we want the current recipe object. So that will be later when we're talking about the recipes. Then we also want the shopping list object. And we want the liked recipes. Okay, and so again, all of this data will be stored at all time in one central variable, which we can then access throughout our controller. Okay, so instead of having many variables, like having the object stored in some place in some variable, or having the recipes like hidden from other functions, from other scopes, we have everything in one place, accessible to everything inside of this module. Okay, so that's a pattern that I really like to use, and it's really helpful in this case. So again, we start with an empty object here. So each time that we reload the app, the state will be empty. And we will actually make some of the state persistent a bit later, which means that when we reload the page, then the state or some part of the state can actually persist. So it can be saved. But let's leave that for later. For now, let's start implementing here part of the controller for the search. And the first thing that we're going to do is to actually add an event listener for the search form. Okay, so basically for this button and for this entire form. So let's take a look at our HTML. And it is up here. So the form that we're looking for is this one here called search. So let's now add an event listener for whenever we submit this form, okay? And event listeners are something that go into the controller because that's where we're then going to delegate what we want to happen when the user submits the form, right? So document.querySelector add event listener, and the event we're looking for is the submit event. And then, of course, our callback function, in which we pass the event object into. Okay, and let's see what actually happens right now. So when we click this here, you see that the page reloads, right? So let's take a look again. And we don't want that to happen. And so we say e.prevent default, right? So we did that before, of course. And then we can now also create a new function that we want to be called whenever the form is submitted. Okay, so instead of putting all the logic here inside of this callback function, let's make a clean new separate function from this. Okay, so control search. Okay, so no arguments here. All we want to do is to put this code basically outside of this callback function here, make a nice separate function just for this. Okay, so whenever we submit a form, we prevent the default from happening, and then the control search function is called. And now let's think what we want to happen. Okay, so I will actually make now a bunch of comments listing each of the steps that must happen here in this search controller. Okay, so the first one is that we should get the query from the view. So let's call this simply query, and I will simply add a placeholder here now and say that we should then do this later, okay? Because in our view module, we will have a function that will get the search query from the user interface, okay? Of course, we could put this right here. We could now do a document query selector and then read that data right from the user interface, but that's something that has to do more with the view. And so we're going to put a method for that, or a function, into the search view module, okay? But we're going to do that in the next lecture, so that we have one lecture for each of these different parts of the architecture, okay? So right now we're talking about a controller, so let's leave it like this for now and then come back in the next lecture and code all of these functions for the view, okay? Now if there is a query, we then want to create a new search object, right? So let's say if query, so if there is a query, then what we want to do next is new search object and add it to state. So let's do that. So state.search will be a new search object with the query, right? So similar to what we did here, but now this time around, we are actually going to store it here into our global state object. So this one that we just talked about in the beginning of the video, right? So let's get rid of this here. And next, what should we do next? Well, we can now prepare the user interface for what's going to happen. Okay, so like clearing previous results or show a loading spinner. And so that's what we're going to do here as a next step. And again, I'm leaving that for the next lecture, but that's one of the steps, so I'm putting it here right now. Next up, let's actually do the search. So search for recipes. And so that's where this method here comes in. So on our state.search object, we now can perform the getResults method, right? So again, state.search is where this object now lives. So this new instance based on the search class. And on that, we of course have the getResults method available so that we can then later display these results in the user interface. And actually that's exactly the next step. So render results on UI. Okay, now of course we only want this here to happen, so we want the rendering of the results only to happen after we actually receive the results from the API, all right? And so what we do have to do here is to actually await this promise, right? So since we use await here, now we need to say that it is an async function. And we do that right here, right? Because this here is where we define the function. And so we say async function so that we can then use await in here. Okay, makes sense? So again, this here returns a promise, right? And why is that? Well, let's open up the method here. So this is an async method. And remember that every asynchronous function, it automatically returns a promise. Okay, and so here we then have to await. So until the promise resolves and comes back with our data. Okay, now we're not really going to render the results on the UI, but what we can do here is then to log these results to the console. So console.log, and where are these results actually stored? So they are in state.search.recipes, right? Or is it result? I'm not really sure. Ah, yeah, it is result. You see, so it stores it into this.result. And so here it's then state.search.result. And let's actually get rid of the console log. Ah, we already did that. So the only console log that we have is going to be this one here. Okay, and so what this means is that the getResults method runs and we wait for it to finish basically, and only after that is done we can then log to the console the result here. Okay, and so with this we can test if this async await here is actually working as intended. So let's test it out. And we don't actually have to input anything here because again it's not really being read right now. Right now we're just using the input pizza here as a temporary query, right? So let's just hit search here and let's wait for it. And indeed, it did came back with our data here. And it's all on pizza, right? And you can see that this console.log came from index.js line 27, which is exactly, well, it's not exactly this one here, but I guess the line number is not correct because of all the Webpack bundling that's done behind the scenes, but it's pretty much the same, 25, okay? So that's really all there is to control right now. So all we have to do now is to actually implement our view so that we can get first the query from the view, that we can then prepare the user interface for the results, like having that spinner, clearing the input maybe, and then finally we want to also render these results on the user interface, of course, instead of just logging it to the console, right? So if you're ready to do that, then just come with me right to the next video. This will be a longer video where we're going to write a couple of functions for the search view. And so in this video, you're going to learn a couple of advanced DOM manipulation techniques. We're going to use ES6 template strings to render entire HTML components. You will learn how to create a loading spinner, which is really cool, I think, and a lot of other smaller things and techniques. So let's get straight to it. So we already have the file here, searchview.js. Let's close up this one here as well. And so yeah, so this module will have a bunch of functions regarding the search view. And so we will export all of them using named exports. Okay, and so let's start by the one to read the input from our input form. Okay, so remember the syntax, we write export, and then when we're using named exports, we just write the name of the variable, the function in this case, that we want to export. So get input in this case. So what do we want to do in this function? Well, all we want to do is really to return the input value of the field. So we will select the DOM element, get the value, and then simply return it. Now we could do document.querySelector and all that stuff here again, but I think it's better to have one central variable where we have all of these DOM elements that we need in our app. And that's a bit similar again to the Budgety app, where we also did something similar, because it's a lot easier to have everything in one central place instead of having these document query selectors all over the place, which can turn into a maintenance nightmare if we ever were to change like this entire underlying markup here. And with this, our views will get a little bit more decoupled from our markup. Okay, so let's now create a new module for that, right here in the views folder as well. And I'm going to call this one base.js. Okay, and we can then also go ahead, before we forget, we can go ahead and import it here, or maybe not yet. Okay, let's first export some stuff here. So what we want to do here is to create an object which will contain all of the elements that we select from our DOM, so all the elements that we need from our app. And we will then export that. So export a variable called element. And so this will be an object again. And I'm doing it as a named export because later on we will have some more stuff here in this module. And so let's go with the named exports here. Okay, so let's call this one search input. And so what we want to do here is document.querySelector, and let's take a look in the markup again. And so the input field that we're looking for is called search field. So let's copy it. And here we go. So now we have an element with a property called search input, which contains this DOM element here, right? Now we also did some document.querySelector in here. And so let's actually get rid of that here as well. Let me copy it and insert it here. And of course, we're needing the name here. So search form for this one. And now let's give it a save. So you see that there's an error here. And so VS Code, this editor here, marks then this file here as red in the entire file tree. Okay. Now we need to, of course, import this element. And so we use the curly braces. Remember, elements from, and this one is in views, and it's called base. Okay. And actually, we can also already start by importing this search view file. Okay. So let's do, and in this case, we are simply going to import all of the functions because we already know that we're going to need all of the functions that are in the view in the controller. Okay, so we want everything as search view. Okay, and remember that this will then be an object in which all of the exported variables from the search view module will be stored. Right, so I explained you that in one of the previous lectures. I hope you remember that. So views and search view. All right, and so now we can say elements, and let's take a look at what we called it. So we called it search form. Let's get that. And so now we should be good to go. And from now on, we're simply going to put all of our DOM elements right here into this object. Okay, so let's do the same here again, actually. So let's get this one and import it here also into the search view. So element dot search input, right? Let's double check. And yeah, so it's called search input. That is our search field. And all we need to do now really is to say that we want the value. So remember that this is an arrow function here, of course. And if you only have one line, then this is an implicit return. So we don't even need to write like return. So this will automatically return this value that we specified here. So elements.searchInput.value, which will be whatever we input into the search field. Okay, now let's give it a try here and replace this pizza that we had here with what we really want. So how do we specify this function? Well, we simply use search view, which is, remember, what we imported from the search view module, and then .get input. And my text editor, VS Code, actually already knows that get input is one of the functions in there. So it's very smart, it's very handy. And so again, it's really a great text editor. Okay, just to make sure that everything works here, let's log it to the console. It should reload now. And we have an error here. So let's go back to searchview.js. And yeah, of course. So I tried to import the base element from the views, but we are already inside of the views folder. And so I don't need any of this. So we're in the current folder and then just base. Okay, and so that should work now. And yeah, it did. So instead of writing pizza now, let's write pasta. And indeed, it writes pasta to the console, gives me the recipes, which are now hopefully about pasta. Yeah, so pasta with pesto, then the best lasagna. And you see that they're all about pasta now. So great, that part is already working. And so let's now do the most exciting part actually, which is printing these results here to the user interface here into this left column of the app, right? So let's think about how we are going to do that. Well, here in the state.search.result, so this one here, this is our array with our 30 results, right? So let's now write a function in the view which can receive all of this result and then print each of the elements, so each of the recipes in that array to the user interface. So let's come back to our search views here and write another function. And I'm going to call this one render results. And what it's going to receive is, of course, all of the recipes. Okay, so we receive an array of 30 recipes here, remember. And so now we need to loop through these in order to then print each of these to the user interface. So let's say recipes dot for each. because remember that is the best way to loop through an array. So instead of having all the logic of printing here in this function, let's do a separate function that has only one purpose, which is to print one single recipe. Okay, and I'm doing that because later we will add some more stuff here when we implement the pagination. And so it's better to have one function for each separate task. Okay, so nicely separating different functionalities into different functions. So I'm going to have another function here, which is going to be called render recipe. And this one will receive just one recipe. Okay, and note that I didn't prefix it with the export command because we don't need to export this function to the outside. We just don't need it outside of this module here. And so it's just like a private function here. Okay, and so we can now call this function here. And we could do it in a more complicated way, like something like this. So with a callback function where we specify the input, and then we say render recipe with the current recipe, but that's actually not necessary because all we need to do is really to write render recipe like this, and it will then automatically pass the current element into this function, into this render recipe. And so for now, all that the render results function is going to do is to loop through all of the 30 results and then call the render recipe function for each of them. And so this is where the rendering will actually happen in this function here. So let's now get the HTML for each of the results, which is stored right here. So I have it here in comments into my HTML file. So what I have here is, let's do a quick overview of the HTML. So we have the header in the top. So you see the header, which is this entire element here. So all of this here is the header. Then on the left side here, we have the results element. And then in there, we already have the unordered list, which is called results list. Okay, so I decided to already put it in the HTML and not have it dynamically generated by JavaScript. So it's easier to already have this and then just fill it up with each of these li elements in JavaScript, which is exactly what we're going to do next. So we have all of these results here. And then down here, well, we have the buttons for the pagination, but we're going to take care of that later. Then in the middle, we have the recipe element. So this big part here. Then we have the shopping list on the right side, as you see. And then I guess, no, that's more in the top. So here we have then this likes panel here. So this here. We're going to hide that here later when there's no like pages. But for now, again, let's leave it as it is. Okay, anyway, what we really want to grab now is this code for one li element. Okay, so let's create a variable called markup. And now remember back in the budgety project, which we still did with ES5, and when we wanted to insert some HTML, we really had to put it all in one line, and it was this really bad looking and confusing syntax. But right now in ES6 with template strings, we can do it in a very easy way. So just make a new template string and then give it some space here. And now we can simply write it like this, as if we would be writing real HTML. So this is really cool, I think, and looks much better. So this looks really like as if we're writing in an HTML file. It actually looks a bit like React here also. Okay, and let's now look at the data and actually also at the final result in order to see how this is supposed to look once it's done. So I have this here also open in another port. So this here is the final working project, okay? So let's write pizza. It has this nice spinner that we're going to implement next. And then we have all the results. So what we have here is this image, then this title, and then down here, the publisher. Okay, so let's see if we can find that data in our results. So let's put pizza here as well. And it should now log it to the console at some point. And indeed, here we go. So let's take a look at the data for each of the recipes. And so we have an image URL, we have the publisher, and we have the title, and also the ID. And so this is all that we need in order to print the results to the user interface. Okay, so let's go through the markup one by one and replace the static data here with our dynamic data coming from the API. So we start here with this part here, and this is actually the ID of the recipe. And you're gonna find out a bit later why this is important when we start loading recipes. But for now, let's simply insert the ID in here. So since we're into a template string, we can now use this template string syntax. So what we want here is, let's go back to grab the name of the property, and it is called recipe ID. Let's actually copy it. And so it's recipe.recipe ID, right? So recipe is the variable that we put into the function, coming of course from this function call down here. And so then from the recipe, we read the recipe ID. Okay, so going back here, and now we changed it, and so yeah, let's get it back here and wait for it, and here we go. So this object here is now our recipe, and then we need to read recipe ID, image URL, publisher, and title. Okay, so next one is the image URL, I guess. And so yeah, it is here. So let's replace this as well. Okay, now here we have the title. And finally, the publisher. Let's just copy this part. And here it's not, it's title. Okay, and let's actually put it here in the alternative text for the image. Let's put the title here as well. Okay, and I think that's it. We just have to remove this class from here, which is for the active class. So that one doesn't really matter. We just need the results link class. Okay, and so this here generates a variable containing the markup that we want to print. But now we need to actually, of course, render it to the DOM. Okay, so where do we want to render it? Well, we want to put it here into the results list. So let's add it here to this elements object. So search result list, let's call it like that, document dot query selector, and let's copy this one here now. And so elements dot search res list. Now remember the insert adjacent HTML method that we used before. Remember that one? Let's take a look at it just to remember how it works. Maybe it's been a long time since you've taken the rest of the course. So I always like to use the MDN library in order to get help about the different methods. So let's take a look at how it works. And so basically we have to specify the position and then the text, so the markup that we just defined. And in here we can do different keywords. So we can put before begin, before end, or after end. And here is basically the position of each of these 4 keywords. So imagine that this here is our list element that we just selected. And so we want our elements to be put before end. So here, okay? So we always want a new element to be put on the end of the list. So first the first one, then the second, then the third, all the way until 30. If we did after begin, then we would put the second one before the first, then the third before the second, and we would end up with the inverse order. Okay? And so we're going to use before end and then the markup. Okay? I hope that made sense. So before end, and then of course the markup. And that's it. So all of this will be executed 30 times, each time for each of the recipes. So let's hope that this actually works. And in order to see it, of course, we need to import it here. So search view dot render results, and we need to pass in the recipes. So that is state dot search dot results. I guess. Let's take a look again at the model just to make sure. And it is called, okay, it's just called result. Okay, does it make sense? Just to make sure that it actually does make sense, we have this result stored inside of our state element, right? We also have our imported functions from the search view, which we did up here. And so now we're bringing everything together here inside of this function. So we read the input from the input field. This one we don't need anymore. Then we create a new search object which contains that query. Then we actually get our results from our API call, wait until that is done, and finally we render it to the user interface, so to the DOM, by using this method that we did in the search view just before. So let's now hope that this actually works. Writing pizza, and we don't have the spinner here yet, of course, but let's wait if it actually happens. And now we have an error here, but that's not a problem at all. So let's try to debug it. So what it says is that recipes.forEach is not a function. So let's find out why by logging to the console what recipes actually is. So console.log recipes. Okay, because it's an array, and so it actually should have the forEach method attached to it. Let's wait for it. Pizza. And we still get the same error. And oh cool, yeah. This is of course just a stupid mistake. Okay, I'm sorry for that. So this is a capital E for each. This is how it works. Okay, so let's reload it. Write pizza again. And let's wait for the result here. And whoa, here we go. So it actually printed our results here to the user interface, just like we wanted it to work. So that is actually perfect. Okay, it's not quite perfect actually, but there are some things that we have to change here, but at least it's now really putting our results here to this page. So that's already a huge step forward. So that's really cool. Next up, there's just some small corrections that we need to do, like clearing this text here from the field. So let's take care of that now. And write a function export clear input. And we're missing the const here, of course. And so this is actually pretty similar to the one before. Elements.search input.value and set it to nothing. Okay, and now we're actually not returning anything here, so it's cleaner to wrap this here into these curly braces, because otherwise there's an implicit return of the result of doing this, and we don't want that. Okay, we're also missing the semicolons down here. It's not a big deal, but let's keep our code clean here. Okay, so clear input is the name of this function, and let's now use it here. So we're going to put it here in prepare UI for results. So search view dot clear input, and that's it. Now another thing that we want is, well, let me actually show it to you why we need to do this. So let's again search for pizza here and wait for our results. So we have our result here, of course, and you see that actually it cleared our input, and let's now search for pasta. And what you will see happening now is that it will add these new results here on the end of these. Okay, and so what we need to do is to actually clear the results before we can display them. And so that's another thing that we can put here in prepare UI for results. So we can clear the input and then also clear the results from the previous search. So let's quickly do that as well. Clear results. And we already have this list selected, so it's just a search res list here. And how do we remove the entire HTML inside of this element? Well, it's actually very easy. We can simply set the inner HTML of the element to nothing. And so the HTML inside it will be empty, which means that it will simply delete all of the HTML, so all of these li elements that are currently in it, right? So let's test that one out as well. So again, our first search is for pizza, which should display in a second here. Here we go. So again, our 30 results. And now pasta. And before showing the new results, it will actually immediately delete these results, right? Well, not really. And so probably our method is not really working. So yeah, it did add these here to the end. And of course it did, because we didn't even call this method. here in the controller. So clear results here. And now it has to work. There's just no way around it. So this time pasta first. Here we go with all our 30 recipes, and now pizza. And you see now it cleared the search list and displayed the new recipes. Now the next thing that we're going to do is to shorten these titles. So we want all of these titles to be just in one line. And if they are too long, well, we just want the first words and then 3 dots here, indicating that the text can continue. So we have some of these here longer than just one line. And so we're going to fix that in the next video, because this one I think is already getting long enough. Let's continue coding up our search view. And so as I mentioned in the last video, the goal for this video is to now reduce this title size here whenever it occupies more than one line. Okay, so basically what we want is for these main titles always to occupy just one line. Now we also don't want to cut words in half. So in this case here, imagine we don't want the CRU, for example, to be up here and then having the rest of the word cut out. So we only want entire words here and then followed by like 3 dots. Okay, so that's kind of a tricky small algorithm that we have to write here. And so let's see if we can pull it off. Okay, so I'm going to add a new function in here. And once more, it will be like a private function. So it's a function that we don't need in the outside world. So const limit recipe title. And what we receive here is a recipe, and we can also receive a limit. So limit of characters that is acceptable as the maximum length of the title. Okay, and let's now actually use something that we talked about in the ES 2015 or ES6 section, which is default parameters. So let's set this one here to 17. And I found out through experimentation that 17 is really the sweet spot here. So it's the best limit for this kind of layout here. But of course we could pass other limits into here. But if we don't pass any limit into the function, then 17 is the one that will be used. Okay. Now the first thing that we're going to do is to test if the length of the title is actually longer than the limit, because only then we need to do something, right? And here it should actually be title and not recipe. So we're only going to pass the title into this one. So if the title dot length is greater than the limit, then we have to do something. And else we will simply return the title again. And I'm not going to write the else statement here actually. So I'm not going to do this one here and then put return title in here, because we're going to have a return statement in here as well. Then it's a good practice to just leave it like this, okay? So we're either going to return something from here and then the function finishes anyway. And if this test here turns out to be false, then we move on to this one here and return the title as it was before, okay? So this of course only applies if the title is longer than the limit that we defined. So how are we going to pull this off? Well, the best strategy that I came up with is to split the title into its words and then use the reduce method on the resulting array, which then allows us to have an accumulator. And that accumulator is just like a variable that we can add to in each iteration of the loop. And what we're then going to do in each iteration of the loop is to test if the current title length plus the next word is still under the maximum length. Okay, so that sounds probably a bit complicated, so let me write it out in code here, and then it will make total sense. Okay, so we take the title and then split it. So split is a method that is available on all strings, and we split it by space. Okay, so let's simply write an example string here as a comment. So pasta with tomato and spinach, for example. Okay, and so by splitting it by the space, this will turn into an array with 5 elements: pasta with tomato and spinach. Okay, and so since we now have an array, we can use the reduce method on it. So reduce, and then we pass a callback function which has the accumulator and the current value as the input. So X stands for accumulator and then the current. Okay. Or let's just write current like this. All right. So this callback function is the first parameter to the reduce method, and then the second one is the initial value of the accumulator, which should be 0. So we start with an accumulator of 0, and then throughout these loops we will add to it. Okay, and I will explain you how and why here in the next steps. So let's actually experiment with this example string here and go through each of these iterations here just to show you how this actually works. All right. So in the first iteration, the accumulator is of course 0, right? As we defined down here. Now we are going to test now in each iteration if the accumulator plus the current dot length, so that's the length of the current word, if it's still under or equal the limit. Okay, and if it is so, then we will push this word into a new array. So let's actually create that array like up here. So a constant new title and just a new array. Okay, and this is a constant which we cannot really mutate, right? So why are we starting it as a new array and then keep adding stuff to it? Well, that's possible because adding stuff to an array is not really mutating the underlying variable itself. And so the title can perfectly be a constant, and we can still keep adding stuff into the array. And the same goes, of course, for objects. Okay, so new title dot push the current word. So let's see why this makes sense. So again, the accumulator in the first one is 0. Then the accumulator plus the current length will be 0 plus 5, right? And 5, which is the result of this here, is still under the limit of 17. And so we can push this word into the new title array. So let's write it out here, that the new title now has the word pasta in it. Okay, and finally we have to update the accumulator. And this works in the reduce function by returning a value. So the value that we return in each iteration of this loop in the callback function of the reduce method will be the new accumulator. So we return accumulator plus the current length. So that's exactly what we did up there in the test. Okay, and so now in the next iteration, the accumulator will be 5, right? And let's actually copy this part here so that we don't have to do it over and over again. And so again, this is here just to simulate what happens in each iteration as we go through this. Okay, so in the second iteration, we're now looking at the word with, right? And so 5 plus 4 is 9, okay? And so 9 is still less than the limit of 17, and so we can add the word with to the array. So let's do that. And then next we return the accumulator plus current length, which will be 9. So in the next iteration, we will have 9 as the accumulator. The next word is tomato, so 6 plus 9 is 15. And 15 is still less than 17. So we can add the word tomato. Right? Then next iteration, now the accumulator is 15. And the next word is and, which is 3. So the current length is now 18, which is of course more than the limit. And so this word is not pushed into the array for the new title. Okay? Up here I'm actually missing the word tomato here. It's not a problem really, it's just so that it doesn't confuse you. Okay? Then in the next iteration, we will look at the word spinach here. And so just to make it really complete, we now have 18 here in the accumulator, plus the length of spinach makes it 24. And so of course it still doesn't pass this test here, and so spinach is also not pushed into the new array, and that's actually it. So we looked at all the 5 words, and our final array is pasta with tomato. Okay? So let's now actually return the result. So let's return, and I'm going to put this in a template string again, or new title And then we can use the join method. And this is basically the opposite of split. So what this will do is that it will join the elements of an array into a string separated by spaces. And so that puts it back into a sentence with spaces between the words. Okay, and then the 3 dots. Oh, and I forgot to close this one here. And okay, so we have our new title, which is this array of the words, which will be joined by putting spaces into the words and then add the 3 dots to show that the title is longer than just the words that are displayed. So I hope this made sense to you. And we could have done this here with the for each method and having an external variable here for the accumulator. And we could have then in each of these iterations have updated that external variable. But the reduce method already has the accumulator built in, and so I thought it's a good idea and a good use case to use this method here. So we had to go through all of this a bit complex algorithm here just because we don't want to cut the words into halves and want full words always in our title sentence. And if you found a simpler way of doing this, then please let me know in the Q&A, but I think this is here actually a good solution and a good use case for some of the JavaScript features like reduce. And it's also always a good thought experiment to come up with this kind of code, right? So let's now actually use this method here. So I'm going to copy it, and where we need it is here in the render recipe function. So here's where we print the title. And so all we need to do is to insert it here and pass in the title, and that's it. So we could now pass here the limit, but as you know, we have it preset to 17, and so there's no need to pass the additional argument into it. So you notice that here in this curly braces in the template string, we can not only use the variables directly, but we can also include functions like I did here. And so that's pretty handy here as well. Okay, so let's now actually test this out. So I'm using pizza again, and let's see. And indeed, here we go. Well, there's something wrong here. So a small bug somewhere where I'm inserting the parentheses, and yeah, here it is. So that shouldn't be there. And so let's now check it out again. Writing pizza. So if you count the characters here now, you will see that they're never more than 17. So 4 and 9 and 14. So that's less than 17. Here we have 4, 8, 13. Here we didn't even need to apply the algorithm. And so we immediately just returned the title because it's only 8 characters long. This one is also less than 17. And so you see that all of them are just on one line now. If we were to increase this here, let's say to 20, then there will probably already be some words that are different. And let's actually do it here. So we can pass 20 now to overwrite that 17. Let's give it a try now. Yeah, we really need that spinner here for the feedback. And so you see that here, these 3 dots, they now moved to the second line already. So that one was too long. Here is the same situation. Here is the same thing. And so, yeah, 17 is really the sweet spot that's best here. Okay, so that's done. And now all there really is to do is to implement this small spinner here that rotates while we are fetching our data from the API. So in order to give the user the feedback that we're actually doing something here and that the app is working. So let's do that right in the next video. Let's continue where we left off in the last video and build our loading spinner. And in order to implement the spinner as fast as possible, let's remember that it should appear here in the search results list, but also here in the recipe whenever we click on one of these results here. Okay, so we should have that in mind and build this spinner, this loader, for reusability. Okay, and so let's actually not include it in the search view, but in base.js. Okay, because again, this is not really just for the search, but we're going to use it later also in the recipes. Okay, and so base here is basically where I put the styles that are reusable and other stuff like these elements. They're also being used and reused across different modules. So let's say export const render the loader. Okay, and now we actually want to pass one argument into this loader, and that is the parent element. Okay, so remember what I mentioned in the beginning, that we will do this loader here for reusability. And so the best way of doing this is to pass in the parent and then say that we want to attach this loader here as a child element of the parent. And so in the case of this list here, we can pass in this parent element here so that the loader will be attached to this. And if it's the recipe, we can then pass in this parent element. All right, so let's create a variable called loader. And then using the template string method that I showed you before. So we're just going to write some HTML here. This one I cannot copy from anywhere, so let's just write it out here. And actually, even inside of JavaScript here, this HTML still gets auto-completed, which is pretty amazing, I think. So we have this div with the loader class, and then in there we have an SVG. And so this is an icon. And then use href, and then in our images, it's the icons.svg, from which we select the icon CW. And that's it. So how does this actually work? So let's take a look at our CSS file here. So that's the CSS file. Let's search for loader, and here we have it. So we style the loader here with this height, this width, and this fill, but the magic really happens here, which is this animation, which is an infinite rotating animation. So that's the animation that I defined here with the keyframes at rule. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but anyway, we have this animation here, which basically makes this icon rotate 360 degrees. Then we say that we want it to be infinite, and so basically as long as the element is on the page, it will keep rotating. Okay, and that's as simple as it gets. So really simple stuff here. That's all we need to do here in this situation. Now, where do we actually attach it to? Well, that's the parent that we pass in. So parent, and then again we use our insert adjacent HTML. Let's take a look again at the documentation here. And so this time around, we're going to put it right after begin here. Okay, so right at the beginning of the parent element. So let's copy this function here. I'm not going to write it out myself. So after begin, and what we want to attach actually is the loader. All right, and that is it, I guess. So moving over to our index.js file here, we now need to edit here, prepare UI for results. So the first thing that we want to do, or actually not so, after clearing the results from the search view, we now want to render our loader. So let's say, and actually we have to import it still. So it is here inside of this base file, right? And so let's actually add the render loader. So these are all named exports. And we could actually have done it with the asterisk import here. So basically importing everything at the same time, but I'm keeping it like this because later we are actually going to add some stuff here that we're maybe not going to use here. And so we don't have to expose it to this global index.js file. Anyway, we can now use render loader here. And all we have to do now is to pass in the parent element. And the parent element where we want this to be is actually this results. Because the results list is an unordered list and we don't want the div inside of that. So this is only for li elements. And so let's actually attach it here in this div. So it is called results. And we need to then add it here into, of course, into this element. So search document.query selector . Okay, let's copy out this one. So elements dot search res. So this renders the loader. Okay, close this one up and let's check it out. And here we go. So here it is. And it keeps rotating and rotating and rotating, waiting for the data to come back. And here we go. So here is our data, but the spinner is of course still rotating here. So that's not ideal, and so let's get actually rid of it. Okay, but let me just inspect it here for you to see it. So that's the icon that we included, and with the, infinite rotating animation here. So that's our spinner. Now we also need a method to get rid of it, right? So let's get back to our base.js and create the clear loader. And this time around, we don't need to specify the parent. All we need to do is to select the loader. Now, right now, we cannot really select it like we did here in the elements. And that's because by the time that this code runs, the loader is actually not yet on the page. And so we cannot select anything that is not yet there. So what we need to do here is to do the document.query selector right here. So const loader document.query selector and then the class. Now, it really bothers me to hardcode this class into this query selector here now. I really want all of these classes like to be in a central place. So just like we did here. So this is a lot cleaner. And in order to achieve the same thing, we will actually create a new object like this. Element strings this time around. So I'm going to call this one loader, and it has the class name of loader, as we already know. Okay, so down here we now can say element strings dot loader, and the same thing actually up here. So if we were ever to change now the loader name in the CSS for some reason, then all we had to do would be to come here to this element, change it here, and then it would work automatically here in both of these methods, instead of being hard-coded down here and also here in the render method. So maybe you think that's a bit overkill, that's not really necessary, but I like to keep things like that because I'm always looking for usability and maintainability, because that's something really important in all coding, not just JavaScript, but also CSS and whatever really you're writing. Okay, so in here we now selected the loader element. Now let's test if it exists so that we can then delete it. Okay, and actually this here is not ready yet because we still need to add the dot. So let's do that using a template string. So dot and then this part. All right, and we cannot add the dot in here because then the dot would also be here in the class name and we don't want that. So this really has to be just a class name, and then we add the dot here for the class selector here right in the query selector. Anyway, if there is a loader, then we want to delete it. And maybe you remember from the Budgety app that deleting an element from the DOM is a bit strange. So we have to go up to the parent element. So parent element, and then basically we move down again and remove a child. Okay, so in order to remove an element, we always have to remove a child. And in order to do that, we need to move up to the parent. Okay, and so we pass in the loader again, which is our element, and that should be it. Okay, so what we want to do here is when we render the results, we first want to start by removing the loader. Okay, and again, we need to actually pass it in here or import it. So we want to render and we want to clear the loader. So all of these methods, we want them to be available here. And so let's say clear the loader, and that should do the job. So it already reloaded. Let's search for pizza again. Whoa, what's that? Well, something's wrong here. I mean, it did the functionality, so it added the loader and then it removed it. But I guess something is wrong with the class names. So yeah, of course it's not elements, it's element strings. So here and down here, it should be element strings. Give it a save. Let's try it again. And yeah, here we go. So now it rotates and it disappears as soon as the results come back. So that's exactly the look that we were for. Okay. Now, next up, we have to implement the pagination. So right now we have all of the 30 results all on the same page. And that's not really helpful because it makes the page way too long. And so what we want to do is to have 3 pages with 10 results on each. And so in the next lecture, that's what we're going to take care of. So see you then. As a last step in the search functionality, let's now implement the search results pagination. And in this lecture, you will actually learn some cool new stuff, including the super useful closest method for doing event handling in a much easier way, and also how and why to use data attributes in order to read data from HTML5 elements. And so let me first show you what we're actually trying to achieve. So I'm going to my working example here. And so what we have down here is this button, which has page 2. When we click it, then we have the next 10 results. We can go back to page 1 and to the next page, page 3, and then we have the next 10 results. And then of course we can go back all the way to page 1. And so let's now go ahead and implement that in our code. And we will implement this functionality in 3 steps. So the first step is to change the render results function, because that's the function that will be called whenever we click on one of the buttons. Okay, so we not only need to pass in the recipes now, but we also need to pass in the page that we want to display. And we can also say that we want to pass in the results per page. Okay, and we can set these here as a default to 10, let's say, and we can also start with page number 1 as a default, but of course we can then override it. Okay, makes sense? So imagine we click on the button to go to page number 2, then this render results will be called and page will be set to 2. Okay, then the second step that we need to implement later is to render these buttons actually on the interface, and then the third step will be to attach some event handlers to these buttons in order to actually make the functionality work. Okay, but let's start with changing some stuff here in the render result. And it's actually not really difficult. So what we want to do here is to not display all 30, but only the number of results per page. So in this case here, 10. Okay, and so let's define a start variable. Let's set it here to an arbitrary number for now, and we're going to implement this logic here later. Okay, but for now let's just put some random numbers here. So we have a start and an end variable. Let's set this one here to 10. This one here to 0. Okay, so that I can now show you what we actually need these variables for. So what we're going to do then, after determining which should be the first recipe to show and which one is the last, well, then we can simply take a part of the total array. So remember that this recipes here is the array of all the 30 recipes. So we can now take just a part of this, which is done using the slice method. And I think we've used this before in one of the other projects. And so the first parameter that we need to pass in is the first point where we want to start basically copying the array. And that's at start. And well, you can guess it. The second parameter is for end. And let me actually show that to you just so you can become more familiar with the documentation. So I usually always like to use whatever I'm searching for and then MDN, which is in my opinion the best web documentation out there. Okay, so you see slice returns a shallow copy of the portion of an array into a new array. Okay, and so we can pass in the begin and the end, which is exactly what we did. And both of them are 0-based indexes. Okay, so how do we actually calculate the starts and the end? And the best way to figure it out is with an example. So let's say you're on page 1, and so you want to start at 0, right? Because the index in the array is 0-based. And so the first position is 0. So on page 1, you want to start on 0, and you want to end on number 9, right? And with that, we will select 10 elements. Now, if we were on page number 2, well, then we would like to start with number 10 here, like this, okay? So how do we implement this? Well, we can simply say page minus 1 times the results per page, right? And that's it. So again, on page number 1, it will be 1 minus 1, 0, and so we will start on 0. On page number 2, it will be 2 minus 1 is 1 times 10, so we will start on page number 10. And of course, on page number 3, it will be 2 times 10, and so we start at 20. And this will actually work for whatever page you passed in here. So we could hard code it specifically just for page 2 and 3, because we know that right now from the API we only get 30 results, but imagine that the API would change in the future and we would get 100 results. And then this code would no longer work, and if you do it like this dynamically, then everything is going to work. Okay, and then the end is actually just the page times the results per page. And that's it. So on page 1 it will be 1 times 10, so 10, and then 20 and 30. And what this means is that actually the end number here is not actually included in the new array. So let's take a look at that here in the doc again. So here's what I was saying. So slice extracts up to, but not including the end. And so when we put 10 here, it will really only copy until 9, which is exactly what we want. So 10 results. Okay, makes sense? So let's actually now go ahead and test this. And if we do it right now, it will actually already work, I'm sure. So if we now type in pizza, we will only get 10 results. So let's wait for it. And let's count them actually. Put some more space here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Perfect. Let's change it here now as a default to 3. And actually, let's also change this one here to 5. Just to see if everything works. And indeed, we get 5 results. Put it back to 10. Let's check it out again. And indeed, here we go. All right, so that's now implemented. Let's now take care of rendering the actual buttons. So let's write a function, render buttons. And you see that this is again a private function. And that's because we will call this function from the render results. Okay. So what do we actually need here? Well, let's put in just a page for now, and we're going to add more arguments later down the road if we need them. Okay, so of course we could have done this functionality here, so the rendering of the buttons right inside the render results. But again, I like to keep different stuff in different functions here, so to make it more reusable and more maintainable. So the goal of this function here is to render the buttons according to the number of the page that we're on. So let me show it to you again, how it should work in the end. So when we're on page 1, then it should only display the button for next. If we're on the second page, so not the first one and also not the last one, then we have both buttons to go back and also to go forward. And when we're on the last page, well, then we only want the button to go back. Okay, so how do we actually now implement this? Well, we need to know on which page we are and also how many pages there actually are. And how do we actually know how many pages there are? Well, all we have to do is to divide the number of results by the results that are displayed per page, right? So we need to pass in that data to our function. So we need the num of results, and we need how many results we have per page, right? Does that make sense? So let's call this one here pages, which will mean, again, how many pages there actually are. And we calculate this by doing the number of results divided by the results per page. So in our example, we have 30 results, and on each page we have 10 results. And so 30 divided by 10 will be 3. And so now we know that we have 3 pages. Now imagine that for some reason this changes here again. So if the API changes in the future, and instead of 30, we get back 45, for example, then 45 divided by 10 would be 4.5 pages. And we don't want that, of course, right? So we want not 4.5, but in this case, we want 5 pages in order to have room to display all of the results. And so we have to use a function which is part of the math object, and it's called math ceil. And so this will basically round it to the ceiling, so to the next integer. So if we had 4.1, then it would round it up to 5. If we had 4.4, it would also round it up to 5. Because if we used normal rounding, then, well, 4.4 would be just 4 pages, because it would be rounding down, right? But we always want it to the ceiling. Okay, so we have 3 pages. And so let's now do some if-else statements. So saying what we just said when we looked at what buttons we want available on each page. So if we are on page 1, so page is 1, well, then we want the button to go to next page. So for now, I'm just writing it down here so that we can then know what to do. Else if, so if we're on the last page, we only want the button to go to the previous page, right? So how do we say the last page? Well, it's just that the page is equal to pages, right? So if we have 5 pages and we are on page 5, well, it means that we're on the last page, right? Here, let's say only button to go to next page. And here we only want the button to go to the previous page. So these are the 2 edge cases, but then we also have the case that we are in one of the middle pages. And so that means that the page is less than pages, right? So in this case, we want both buttons. Okay, now imagine that we only have one page. Then in that case, we actually don't really want to display any buttons at all, right? So let's say here that the page should be 1 and pages should be greater than 1, okay? Which means that there are actually more than one page. And the same thing applies to the last case. So in case that we're on the last page, well, we really only want a previous button if there are more than one pages. And so let's now actually write the code for the buttons. And you see that we will have a lot of duplicate code here, right? Because we will have a button here, and here we will actually have both buttons, and here we will again have a button. And so all of this HTML code will actually be pretty similar. And so what we can do is to once more export it to an outside function. Okay, so let's do that. Const create button. So what do we need to pass into this function, which is going to render the button? Well, we need to pass in the number of the page that we're in, so that it can then print that number to the interface, and we will have to say if it's a button to go back or to go forward. And so let's call that one the type. Let's now go to the HTML and actually grab the button here, because it should already be somewhere here. And let's actually get this here as a comment. And now before we paste it here, I can see that we can actually get rid of these parentheses, because all we really want to do from this function here is to return the markup for this button. Okay, so we're going to render it down here inside of the render button functions. Okay, and so from here we are actually only going to create the markup. And so we just want to return a template string from this one here. And so this is now just some regular HTML here as a comment, as you know already. Okay, so this is just so that we see what's the difference between the previous and the next button. So you see here that we have the results button previous and the results button next. So that's one of the differences. And also here in the icon. So here we have left and here we have right. Okay, but that's actually all there is. So let's go ahead and copy this one here. That's not correct. All right, so let's start with the number here. So imagine that we're on page number 2 and that we want a previous button. So in that case, we want to say page number 1 here, right? And in case we are on a next button, well, then we actually want page number 3. And so depending here on this type, we can now specify what we want to display here in this page number. So let's say that here as the type, it can either be previous or it can be next. Okay, and both as strings, of course. So in here, whenever we call this create button, we are going to pass in the number of the page that we're currently in, and either if it's a previous or a next button. Okay, and so let's now use the ternary operator here in order to make an if-else statement, but in just a single line. Okay, so we can say if the type is previous, so previous, well, then what we want is page -1. And if it's not, then we want page +1. Okay, makes sense? So imagine we have a previous button and we're on page number 2. well, then we want to display that we want to go to page number 1, so 2 minus 1. But if we have a next button, well, then on that button it should say page number 3, and so that's page plus 1. Okay, next up we can do the same here for the icon, so we have left and right. So again, if it's a previous button, then the arrow should point to the left side, and in the other case, it should point to the right side. Okay, and so that icon here coming from the icons.svg will then display exactly that, what we want to do. Next up, we have this class name up here. So results button previous for the previous button and next for the next button. So here we can simply plug in this type. So let's get rid of this and just say type. Simple as that. And so that's almost it. There's just one more thing that we need to do here, which is to actually plug in the data into this button containing the number of the page where we want to move whenever we click this button. Okay, so basically we need to encode this number here, and I can actually copy it right now so that it's stored inside of this element, inside this component. And so in HTML5, there's something called the data attributes. And so we can say data, and then we can specify a random name. So like go to, so go to page, so the page that we want to go to. And then let's simply paste in here the number that we want to be here. Okay, and we're then going to use this property here later when we attach the event handler to these buttons. Okay, so just keep in mind that we're going to use this one here later, and by then I'm going to explain to you why. Now all we need to do is to call actually this function here in all of these different cases. Okay, so create button with the current page, and then in this case here we want the prev, so the previous, right? And actually no, we want the next, of course. From page number 1 we want to go to the next page. Now this here should then be assigned to a variable, right? Now we cannot use a const here, right? So we cannot say const button, and that's because const and let, so the new ways of declaring variables in EX6, they are block scoped, and so they're only available inside of this block. Okay, and so if I declare it inside of this block, well, then button is not going to be available outside of this block. So what I have to do instead is to declare the variable outside with a let, because we will want to change it. Okay, so we cannot use const here because we then want to reassign it. Okay, so now we can say button in here, we can say button here, but with prev, and then we can also say button in here. But here, remember, we actually want both buttons. And I'm not sure why I deleted the comments. Let's go back here. So prev, and here we want both buttons. So now we need a string which contains one button for next and one for prev. So let's do that. So a template string again here. I'm not sure why this one closed. So one for next and one for previous. Okay, so I created a string which contains the result of calling these function here 2 times. So these 2 strings, and so we will then have these 2 buttons. Okay, so all we need to do now is to actually then insert this new element right into our DOM. And so where do we actually want this? Well, let's go back to our HTML, and well, it should be inside of this div here called results pages. So let's add it to our element. So we have search res and search res lists. Let's now add search res and pages. So elements dot search res pages dot insert adjacent, and not element but HTML. We want it at after begin, So right at the beginning of the element, and then, of course, the element we want to insert, which is, of course, the button. Whew, so that was a lot of code. Let's actually take a look if this is working. Okay, so this is our result. Oh, and I see an error here already, and it is in base.js. Let's take a look. And actually it is red here in the code editor. It was already telling me something's wrong. And for some reason I added this semicolon, which I shouldn't. And so let's see if it works now. Give us some more space. And I do not see any buttons down here. And yeah, of course I don't, because we did never call the, where is it? So we did never call the render buttons. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So some comments here. Render results of current page. And render the pagination buttons. So render buttons with the page, which is page. The number of results is the length of the recipe, right? So recipes is the array which contains all of the recipes, and length then gives us the amount of recipes that are in there. And then finally, the third one is results per page, which is just results per page, which is this one that we get as an input to this function. And so let's take a look at that again. And so, well, something is not right here. And I guess, yeah, the problem is that we're still on page 3. So of course we always want to start on page number 1. And so here we go, page 2. Well, the icon is not really at the right place, but we're gonna take care of that in a second. And then of course, if I click, then it doesn't do anything yet because we didn't yet attach the handler. Let's just inspect this element here so that I can show you this data attribute that we added. And so this one here. So we have the data.goTo, which is set to 2. And so next, when we're adding the event listeners, this is how we'll know which page we should move to. Okay, so instead of reading it from the text, so from this DOM element here, we will simply read this property here, which is a lot better. Okay, so it works on page number 1, and so let's hope it also works on page number 2. And we're gonna test that once we have our event handlers properly working. And so that's what we're going to do next, actually. So that's going to be in the controller again. So in the controller is where we have all our event listeners, and we then control what should happen based on what was clicked, of course. Now in this case, we actually have a small problem, because where do we actually attach these event listeners to if the pagination buttons are not yet there when the page is loaded? And so we have to use something called event delegation again. So we used that before in the course. And so the concept is that we attach the event listener to an element that is already there, and then we try to figure out where the click happened so that we can then take action based on that. Okay, and so the element that is actually already available at load is this one, so results page, which is where we put the buttons into. And so that's where we have to put our event handler. So elements.search res, and it is here pages. Add event listener on click. We want to have access to the event so that we can then use the target property. Remember that one. And so let's actually log it to the console. So e.target. So e is our event here, our click event in this case, and then the target. So exactly where this click happened. Now in order to be able to view 2 buttons and not just one, let's go to page 2, because then we should have the previous and next button. So let's test it out. And indeed, we have page 1 and page 3. And so let's now click on the buttons. And you see that here now we have the element where the click happened. Now I clicked here on this text. Now watch what happens when I click on the icon. you see that we then get the icon. And if I click here outside really on the button, well, then we get something else. And so how do we actually now define where we want the click to happen? Or in other words, how do I say that I want something to happen when I click on this button, when in reality I'm clicking at this text or maybe even at this icon and not really the button element itself that I'm looking for? So how can we do that? Well, we actually have something that helps us in JavaScript for dealing with just that. And that is the closest method. So again, let me try to show that to you. So it works on all DOM elements, and you see that closest returns the closest ancestor of the current element which matches the selector given in the parameter. Okay, so let's see that in action. I'm going to create a new variable here actually. So let's say button. So e.target, and now the closest. And so now in here we put a selector. And the selector that we want is the class of the button that we're actually looking for. So let's go back here. And so what we're looking for, and well, now it's gone, so I cannot show it to you anymore. But the button that we're looking for is the one with the button inline class, right? So I showed you that we sometimes click on this SVG here or on this span, but really we're only interested in clicks to the button itself. And so we can now use the closest method and say that we are only interested in the ones with the class of button inline. Okay, and now I should actually go ahead and save this in the element strings here. So put it in here, but I'm not going to do that because then I would have to do the same here for this one and for this one here as well. And so right now I'm not going to go down that route. Okay, so let's keep it simple here. And right now I'm going to simply log the button. So what's going to happen here is that now, well, let me show it to you. So what happens now is that I still click here on the span or on the icon like this, but it will then find the closest element with the button inline class. So this is exactly the button that we're looking for. So no matter where I click now, we only get the button, which is exactly where this data here is located. Okay, so what we're interested for is the button where we have stored the page number. So this one here is page 3, and this one will of course show page 1. Okay, and so that's the number that we're interested for, and therefore we really need to just select this exact element and not any of their child elements. Okay, so let's now say if there is a button, then let's read the go-to page. Okay, and so now we're actually going to read out the data that is stored in that data attribute that I showed you. And it is so useful because all we have to do now is to say button.dataset.goto. And that's it. Let's log it to the console. And test it out, of course. And you see it shows me 1 and here 3. And that is again, of course, because it's saved inside of this attribute. So we can read out this data attribute whenever we prefix an attribute with data, then this variable here gets stored in the dataset.goto here in this case. Okay, and if it was something else, then of course, for example, if I had page here, then it would be dataset.page here. Okay, and so this is a very handy way of having access to data. Now you saw here maybe that this is not really a number, it's really a string, because a number looks like this. So it's in the console, it's shown blue, and so we have a string here really, and so we still have to convert it to a number. So we can use parse int, so it will basically convert it to an integer, and we still have to specify the base of the number, which is 10 here, right? So 10 just means that we're on base 10, so from 0 to 9. For example, if I were to put 2, then we were in binary, and so we will only use the 0 and the 1. But that's not the case, we are on base 10, so let's just keep it like that. Okay, now all we need to do is to use our render results method, or function. Now all we have to do is to call it just like we did before, but specifying the page, which by default should be 1, of course. And so let's do that. So we used it before here to render, and here we didn't pass it any number because we could simply pass in number 1, but that's the default anyway. So let's not do that. So all I'm going to do is to just copy it here. I'm still leaving the go-to page down there so we can check it out. And then all we need to pass in is the go-to page. And that's it. That's all we need to do, really. So I hope this is making a ton of sense to you. And I'm sure it is. So let's now click on 2. And it will add these new down here below. Okay, we also have all of this here. So that's not ideal, of course. So whenever we add some more results here, we first should actually clean out the list before we keep adding to it, of course. So we have render results, but before we do that, let's actually use clear results. And we did that before here again. So clear the results. And so now it's becoming really handy that we have it all nicely separated into our different functions and modules, because we are of course reusing all of this code from before. And so we just have to do clear results and render results again here. Just get rid of this one here. And the other problem was with these buttons. So we should actually also clear out the buttons. Okay, so let's do that in the clear results. And it should be here. So clear results. And so we also have to say search rest pages.innerHTML should be empty as well. Let's try it out one more time. So that is page 1. And here we go. Page number 2 with the next results. And finally page number 3. And great. That's awesome. So it's really working. Also, the numbers here are correct. What's just not correct is these, this should actually be on this left side, and this here should be on the right side. So I'm not really sure why that is happening, but let's take care of that for a second. For now, let's just appreciate that it's really working. So it tells us to go back to page number 2, because we are on page number 3. Now we're on page number 2, and so now it says go back to 1 or next to 3. And then here we just have the forward button, just as we said here in our render buttons code. So just as we did here, right? And the problem with the text being on the wrong side is just because this one here should actually come before the icon. Okay, and so now everything will be perfect. Just one last time before we can finish with this video. And so now it works. So perfect. So I hope that wasn't all too complicated for you. And of course, when you're doing your own app, you're not going to implement it in the exact same way. And so all I want you to really understand is the entire logic behind this pagination. So basically creating the start and the end numbers, and then rendering the buttons here according to the page that we're currently on. Okay. Also, it's important to remember event delegation, which is something really important again in JavaScript. And we did that here again. We did it on other projects, but so now here we did it once more for you to remember it. Okay. Anyway, this was a huge lecture. Great to see that you're still with me here, and take a break now, and then see you in a second in the next one. Welcome back. Now that the search functionality is fully implemented, let's start working on the model for a single recipe selected from the search results. And so let's start by creating a new file in our models folder, of course. So recipe.js. And this one will actually be a bit similar to the search model. Okay, so let's open up this one here side by side. I can close these files. For now, I don't longer need them. So again, we're going to use access here for our Ajax call, and we will also create a class for this recipe to hold all the data for one recipe object. Okay, so import Axios from Axios, and we will export a default class called recipe. We give ourselves a constructor And this time what we're going to pass in will be the ID. Okay, and then we say this.id equals the ID that we pass in. Okay, so each recipe is identified by an ID, and when we create a new recipe object, what we will pass in is that exact ID. And based on that ID, we can then later do the AJAX call in order to get the rest of the data for the recipe. Okay, and so that's actually the next method that we're going to code, which will be called getRecipe. Okay, and we already know that we're going to use an async here. And so for now, you're super familiar with this stuff already. Okay, let's then use a try catch, such as before. And here just console.log the error in case there is any. But what really matters is, of course, what happens here in the try block. So let's set the result to what we await from the AJAX call using Axios again. Okay, so that's again very similar to what we had here. Now we need again or key and or proxy. And so we could now go ahead and copy these here to the recipe model, but that's not ideal, because then imagine that we had a new key or a new proxy, then we would have to change it in 2 places. And that's not ideal. So instead of doing that, let's create a configuration file where we can store these 2 variables, then import this file into these 2 files, so into these 2 models, so that we can then use these variables in there. Okay, so we're going to do that right in the home, in the home JavaScript folder, so in here. And I'm simply going to call it config.js. And so I'm going to take these out of here and put them right here. Okay, now it's not actually the best practice to have this kind of data here stored on the client side. Okay, because everyone using your app can easily access, for example, your key. Now in this case, it's not really a big deal, but please remember to never store any real sensitive data like this, so on the JavaScript client side, okay? And ideally, you would do maybe these AJAX calls on your own server and then have your own API from that server, from where you would then do the AJAX call in the front-end client, okay? But for now, in this example, this is perfectly acceptable, okay? So let's then go ahead and import it here, first into the search, and we're going to do a name export, so key and proxy, from another path to the module, which is 1 folder above, so ... and then config. Okay, and so where that or proxy and key variables are back here in this file. Just copy them to this other file, to the recipe, and so now we're good to go. Okay, now let's actually go ahead and copy what we have here and then do some changes, because the URL is really the same, okay, at least up until this point. So let's take out this part, and in order to figure out how we get the recipe, let's then go back to the documentation. Okay, so we have the search and we have the get recipe, remember, and the search request should be to API/search, the one that we used before, and in order to get the recipe we use API/get. Okay, and then the parameter is again the key, and then also the recipe ID, which is here called or ID. So we use the get route, and then we pass the key into, and also the recipe ID. And that recipe ID will be the one stored in our object. So this.id, right? And that's it. So again, this Axios call here will then return a promise, which we await because we're in an async function. And so again, we're using async await, which I believe is the best way of using asynchronous JavaScript. Okay, and now just to test this out actually, so in order to see what kind of data we get back from the server, let's just log the result to the console so that we can then figure out what exactly from the response we need to save. Okay, so this should work for now. Let's now go ahead into our main controller, import this recipe model, and then create a new recipe from it. So import recipe from same folder, models, and that's it. Let's add some small comments here. So this was the search controller. And then let's also have the recipe controller. Okay, so we're not going to do the recipe controller just yet, but we already then have our code ready for that. So let's simply create a new variable here for now, just to have a new recipe. And let's pass in an ID. Now, what ID do we actually want to pass in here? Well, let's try out one of the ones that we already have. So let's try to get one from our search result. So we use pizza again, and something did not work here. So we get this error here, and here we see that we have the proxy and the key both set to undefined. So there was probably something wrong with the config file. And yeah, indeed. So here we have to add to export. So in order to actually export these variables from the file. And now that should be working. So let's reload it. And now we should get back the results very soon. And here we are. Now, if we click on one of these, then we will actually have the ID here displayed in the URL bar, right? Because remember that back in the view, let's take a look at that. So in the search view, where we displayed the search result, so where is that? Yeah, so we put the recipe ID here in the href, so this hash symbol and then the recipe ID. Okay, and so that ID is exactly what we need to search for recipes. Okay, and so let's go ahead and copy this number here and then plug it in here into this new recipe. Okay, and so all we need to do now is to call the getRecipe method on this newly created object, right? Because of course this object here inherits this getRecipe method from its prototype. Okay, so that's basically how the ES6 class works behind the scenes with prototypal inheritance. So r.getRecipe, and that should then trigger this console.log here right after we receive back the data from the recipe with the ID that we passed in here as this number. So let's give it a try. It should now reload. It actually already did it here down here. So you already have the data here, and if you open up the data property, then we have our recipe in here. Okay, so we have data.recipe, and then in there we have all kinds of stuff. So we have the image URL, then we have an array of ingredients here. Okay, then we have the publisher, the URL of the publisher, the recipe ID again, and the source and the title. So the source is where the recipe actually comes from and where the directions are. And so we're actually going to need most of these properties that we have in here. Okay, so we need the title, we need the publisher, so the author basically, we need the image, we need the URL itself, and we also need the ingredients. Okay, and all of this data here live at data.recipe. Okay, so let's now go ahead and save all of these to our object. So we want to have the title, so this .title will be, remember, res.data.recipe.title. Okay, so res is the actual result, and then remember that we saw in the console that we have data.recipe where all of this data lives that we need now. Okay, so this.author, I'm going to call it author and not publisher, is at res.data.recipe.publisher. Next up, we want the image. And let's actually just duplicate this here a couple of times. So the URL, which is called the source URL here in the data. And then finally, we want the ingredients. And so that should be working now. So let's get rid of this console.log here. And what I'm going to do instead here is to log our object. So again, this is just for testing, of course, but now I want to actually see the entire recipe. And so here it goes. And indeed, we have our author, the ID, the image, which for some reason is not really working. Then we have the ingredients, we have the title and the URL. So that's all that we need in order to display the recipe on the UI here in one of the next steps. Okay, now something wrong here with the IMG. So probably there was some typo there. And in here, I guess it's just image. Okay, so let's wait for it again. And here you go. So now it's actually there. All right, so that's the data that comes back from the server. Now let's just add a couple more things to our data model. So let me show you how our app works in the end. So what we have here is not only the stuff that we got from the server, but we also have the cooking time and we have the amount of servings. Okay, so let's now add some methods to calculate these. Okay, so let's do calc time. Now, of course, we don't have an accurate way to estimate the time it takes to cook one of these recipes. So let's just do a very, very rough estimate and assume that for every 3 ingredients, we need 15 minutes. Okay, so let's start by saying that the number of ingredients is this dot ingredients dot length, because remember, these ingredients here, it will be an array of all the ingredients. Okay, and so with length, we get how many ingredients are in there. Then let's calculate how many 15 minutes periods we have. So periods, so we have the number of ingredients divided by 3, and we want to round it up to the highest integer. So math.ceil, and we already reused this one before, right? And so finally we can calculate the time, which is just a period times 15. Okay, let's add that comment here in order to make sense of this code. Okay, so something very simple here. And now for the servings, we're actually not going to do any calculations at all. We're just going to say that this.servings is 4. Okay, so again, we could have like a very complex algorithm here trying to figure out how many servings we are based on the amount of ingredients, but that's not necessary at all. We just say that we have 4 servings on each of the recipes. And okay, that's it for our data model. We're going to add some more stuff to it later, but for now this is enough to get us started with the recipes. Now to finish, let's just test out our error handling here as well. And let's add like an alert here so that the user can actually see the error. And let's actually just say something went wrong. And a sad face. Okay, and so let's assume that we put in the wrong key. So let's just add a couple of random numbers here. And so this, of course, will be a wrong key, and we should then have an error message. Okay, so let's try it out. And indeed, we get this error here, which says we have no access to this resource, which of course is because we have a wrong key. And then the user also gets this message here, something went wrong. Okay, so this also works. So the try catch here again is working. And so let's now start working on the controller of this recipe part right in the next video. In this video, we will implement a controller for the recipe section. And this is actually a pretty cool lecture where you will get some new knowledge. And so you will learn how to read data from the page URL by responding to the hash change event. And also how to add the same event listener to multiple events. So probably quite a long video, so let's get started. So in order to figure out how to implement a controller, let's think again about how we implemented the search functionality. So what we have here is that whenever we click on one of these recipes, we get the ID of that recipe right here in the URL bar, right? So take a look at this here whenever I click on these different recipes. So you see that the ID there changes. Now inside this URL, this entire part here is called the hash, okay? So it's the hash symbol and then whatever comes after that. So this here is the hash. And we can then actually make use of the fact that we change these hashes here whenever we click on one of these different recipes by using the hash change event in JavaScript. Okay, so there's an event that's called hash change that is fired off each time that the hash that we have in the URL changes to something else. Okay, and so let's go ahead and use that event. Okay, so this was just for testing here. And so let's now add an event listener. And this one we will actually add to the global object in JavaScript, so in the browser, which is window. So window.add event listener and then the hash change. Okay, and what we want to call here is the control recipe function, which we didn't write yet, but that's what we're going to do next. Okay, so we had the control search function here. And so let's now create control search. So first thing that we should do in here is to actually get that hash, okay? So I'm calling this one the ID. And we can get it from window.location. Okay, so window.location is the entire URL. And if we then use the .hash property on it, well, that's then just the hash. So let's try that one out. Console.log the ID. So remember that we have this event listener here whenever we change the hash, which will then call the control recipe, which will log the current hash to the console. Okay, and of course we need some examples here again. So here we go. So take a look at this, where the ID of the search item that I click here, which is this one, will be translated here into the console, right? So you see that? Now if I click twice on the same, then nothing appears because we didn't change the hash, okay? And so the event is not fired. But each time I click on a new one, then the ID is here, of course, in the URL in this hash, and then also down here. So great, that part's already working. Now what we're really interested in is only this part, so only the ID, but without the hash. So let's take care of that. And we can simply do a simple replace, because this is a string, and so we can of course call all the string methods on it, and we will then replace the hash with nothing. Okay, and with that, the hash symbol will be gone. Okay, so let's now go ahead and do something with this ID. And first off, we need to change if we actually have an ID. Okay, because imagine that we would simply do this, so get rid of everything, then we don't have any ID, and so we don't want to create a recipe object. So we only do all this logic that we're writing next in case that we actually have an ID. So let's add some comments here, just like we've done before. So get the ID from the URL. Then prepare the UI for changes. So this is similar to what we had before again. Create a new recipe object, of course. Then get the recipe data. Then we need to call our functions that they created for the servings at the time. So calc time and calc servings. So we need to call them here as well. And finally, when we have all of this in place, we can then render the recipe. Okay, so let's fill this here up with whatever we already have. So prepare UI for changes. We don't have any UI methods just yet, but what we can do here is to create the new recipe object. Okay, and of course, again, we will put this in our state. So we already have the search inside our state, and next we will put then the recipe. So state.recipe will be a new object based on the recipe. And of course, what we pass in here is then our ID. Okay, next up, let's get the data from the server. And so we need to call getRecipe, right? So that's one is at state.recipe.getRecipe. Now, of course, we want this to happen asynchronously. So in the background and in a way that the rest of the code is only executed after we get back with the data. So we are going to use, of course, await here, and don't forget to then change the function to an async function. So yet another async await function here so that we can load our recipe data in the background. Next up, state.recipe.calc servings. All that starts with calc time. Okay, and finally, we can then render the recipe to the UI. We cannot do that just yet, but let's simply log the object, okay? So state.recipe, because for now we don't have any UI methods just yet. Okay, so let's quickly go over that again. So we start by getting the ID from the URL by using window.location.hash and then replace the hash symbol with nothing, so that instead of the hash, we just end up with the actual ID that we need for the search. Then we create a new recipe object based on a model that we coded up in the last lecture, save it in our state, just like we did with the search. So again, all of our data is stored in one central place, which is the state that we can then get access to. Then after that, we call getRecipe here, which due to the fact that it's an async function, will return a promise. And so therefore in here we use await to wait for the promise to get back with the resolved value. Okay, so here the code will stop executing, and then after that, we will simply calculate the time, the servings, and log everything to the console. So let's test that one out. Searching for pizza again, and let's try this one, pizza dip. So we get the ID, of course, and then our recipe. And all the data is actually here. So that's amazing, right? So we can right now select recipes from our search list, and it will already display the data here in the console. So here's the next one, and if we click on another one, then of course it will work as well. And so great, that part is already working. Now imagine that we would reload this page here. Okay, then nothing happens, because again, this only happens whenever the hash actually changes. Okay, and so we need to fix that, because imagine that the user saves this URL here as a bookmark, for example, and then when he comes back, then nothing happens really. Okay, and so what we need to do also is to add an event listener to the load event, which basically fires whenever the page is loaded. So window.add event listener, load, and then control recipe. Now I promised you in the beginning of the video that I would show you how to basically add the same event listener to different events. And that's useful here because we're calling the same function here simply for these two events. Okay, so let me show that to you. And it's actually very simple. We just need to think a little bit about it. Okay, so let's comment out these two. And what I'm going to do is to do an array with these two events. So hash change and load. And then I will simply add a loop to it. So a for each, where each of the elements is an event. And I will then do window.add event listener. And then in here we pass the event. So event, and then of course control recipe. And that's it. So we just went from 2 lines here to just 1 line of code. Now if we had like 10 lines with these events, then of course it would become even more useful. Okay, so let's get rid of this here, and I hope this made sense to you. So again, we saved the strings for these 2 event types into an array, and then looped over them and called window.eventListener for each of them, passing in the corresponding event. Okay, and so let's check it out now. Let's reload it. And you see that now it's happening. Okay, so the load event is now doing its work here, and it doesn't only work in case that the hash actually changes, but also if the page loads. Okay, and so now it's even more important that we have that if statement which checks if there's actually an ID, okay? Because right now there's not an ID, and so we, of course, don't want anything of this here to happen. Now finally, and this is something that we didn't do in the other controller, is that this await here can of course go wrong. So right now we're assuming that this promise here will always resolve, but of course it can get rejected. So we actually talked about that before in the last lecture, where I intentionally put a wrong key here. So in that case, the promise rejects. And this will of course then also have an effect here on this async await, right? So in order to handle that event here as well, let's add another try catch here. And so we actually, all of this we only want to happen in case that everything goes well, right?